Welcome to chapter 13 and Things Fall Apart. In this chapter you're going to see a funeral ceremony, and I want you to pay attention to how Achebe's description of the events create a sense of tension throughout the chapter. Go, di go, di go, di go, di go. It was the Ekwe talking to the clan. One of the things every man learned was the language of the hollowed-out wooden instrument. Dim, 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 boomed the cannon at intervals. The first cock had not crowed, and Umuafia was still swallowed up in sleep and silence when the Ekwe began to talk, and the cannon shattered the silence. Men stirred on their bamboo beds and listened anxiously. Somebody was dead. The cannon seemed to rend the sky. Di go go, di go, di go go, floated in the message-laden night air. So it's almost like they're using this Ekwe, this drum, as kind of a system of Morse code. So it's kind of interesting. The faint and distant wailing of women settled like a sediment of sorrow on the earth. Now and again a full-chested lamentation rose above the wailing whenever a man came into the place of death. He raised his voice once or twice in manly sorrow, and then sat down with the other men listening to the endless wailing of the women and the esoteric language of the Ekwe. And esoteric just means that it's an adjective that describes like a specialized kind of knowledge. Now and again the cannon boomed. The wailing of the women would not be heard beyond the village, but the Ekwe carried the news to all the 9 villages and even beyond. It began by naming the clan. Umuafia Borodike, the land of the brave. Umuafia Borodike, Umuafia Borodike. It said this over and over again, and as it dwelt on it, anxiety mounted in every heart that heaved on a bamboo bed that night. Then it went nearer and named the village, Ezeudu of the yellow grinding stone. It was a Conquo's village. Again and again Ezeudu was called, and the men waited breathlessly in all the 9 villages. At last the man was named, and people sighed. Ezeudu is dead. A cold shiver ran down Okonkwo's back as he remembered the last time the old man had visited him. "That boy calls you father," he had said. "Bear no hand in his death." Ezeudu was a great man, and so all the clan was at his funeral. The ancient drums of death beat, guns and cannon were fired, and men dashed about in frenzy, cutting down every tree or animal they saw, jumping over walls and dancing on the roof. It was a warrior's funeral, and from morning till night warriors came and went in their age groups. They all wore smoked raffia skirts, and their bodies were painted with chalk and charcoal. Now and again an ancestral spirit or a gugu appeared from the underworld, speaking in a tremulous, unearthly voice, and completely covered in raffia. Some of them were very violent, and there had been a mad rush for shelter earlier in the day when one appeared with a sharp machete and was only prevented from doing serious harm by 2 men who restrained him with the help of a strong rope tied round his waist. Sometimes he turned round and chased those men, and they ran for their lives. But they always returned to the long rope he trailed behind. He sang in a terrifying voice that a Quensu, or evil spirit, had entered his eye. But the most dreaded of all was yet to come. He was always alone and was shaped like a coffin. A sickly odor hung in the air wherever he went, and flies went with him. Even the greatest medicine men took shelter when he was near. Many years ago another Gugu had dared to stand his ground before him, and had been transfixed to the spot for 2 days. Transfixed means he was just stuck to the spot. He couldn't move. He stood there for 2 days. This one had only one hand, and it carried a basket full of water. So you can kind of see that Gugu probably represents like death, or a figure of death. But some of the Ezeudu were quite harmless. One of them was so old and infirm that he leaned heavily on a stick. He walked unsteadily to the place where the corpse was laid, gazed at it a while, and went away again to the underworld. The land of the living was not far removed from the domain of the ancestors. There was coming and going between them, especially at festivals, and also when an old man died, because an old man was very close to the ancestors. A man's life from birth to death was a series of transition rites which brought him nearer and nearer to his ancestors. That's a really interesting sentence to me. That's one of my favorite in the book, really. I want to read it again. He says, a man's life from birth to death was a series of transition rites which brought him nearer and nearer to his ancestors. And to me, that's a really poetic way to say that as soon as we're born, we begin to die. Think about that. It's true. Ezeudu had been the oldest man in his village, and at his death there were only 3 men in the whole clan who were older, and 4 or 5 others in his own age group. Whenever one of these ancient men appeared in the crowd to dance unsteadily the funeral steps of the tribe, younger men gave way and the tumult subsided. Think about the way he's using this word tumult and see if you can define it in context. It was a great funeral, such as befitted a noble warrior. As the evening drew near, the shouting and the firing of guns, the beating of drums and the brandishing and clanging of machetes increased. Ezeudu had taken 3 titles in his life. It was a rare achievement. There were only 4 titles in the clan, and only 1 or 2 men in any generation ever achieved the 4th and highest. When they did, they became the lords of the land. Because he had taken titles, Ezeudu was to be buried after dark, with only a glowing brand to light the sacred ceremony. But before this quiet and final rite, the tumult increased tenfold. Drums beat violently and men leaped up and down in frenzy. Guns were fired on all sides and sparks flew out as machetes clanged together in warriors' salutes. And these warriors' salutes are just when 2 of these warriors carrying machetes run toward one another and they like clang these machetes in the air and it creates these sparks. The air was full of dust and the smell of gunpowder. It was then that the one-handed spirit came, carrying a basket full of water. People made way for him on all sides, and the noise subsided. Even the smell of gunpowder was swallowed in the sickly smell that now filled the air. He danced a few steps to the funeral drums, and then went to see the corpse. "Ezeudu," he called in his guttural voice, "if you had been poor in your last life, I would have asked you to be rich when you came again. But you were rich. If you had been a coward, I would have asked you to bring courage. But you were a fearless warrior. If you had died young, I would have asked you to get life. But you lived long. So I shall ask you to come again the way you came before. If your death was the death of nature, go in peace. But if a man caused it, do not allow him a moment's rest." He danced a few more steps and went away. So it's a really interesting thing that he said here. He says if you're died of natural causes, go in peace. But if somebody caused your death, I want you to haunt that person. The drums and the dancing began again, and reached fever heat. Darkness was around the corner, and the burial was near. Guns fired the last salute, and the cannon rent the sky. And then from the center of the delirious fury came a cry of agony and shouts of horror. It was as if a spell had been cast. All was silent. In the center of the crowd, a boy lay in a pool of blood. It was the dead man's 16-year-old son, who with his brothers and half-brothers had been dancing the traditional farewell to their father. Okonkwo's gun had exploded, and a piece of iron had pierced the boy's heart. The confusion that followed was without parallel in the tradition of Umuafia. Violent deaths were frequent, but nothing like this had ever happened. The only course open to Okonkwo was to flee from the clan. It was a crime against the earth goddess to kill a clansman, and a man who committed it must flee from the land. Remember what Obierica told Okonkwo a few chapters ago? That killing a Kemefuna was the kind of thing for which the earth goddess punished entire families? And we talked about how that was a kind of foreshadowing. This is what it foreshadowed. The crime was of 2 kinds, male and female. Okonkwo had committed the female because it had been inadvertent, which means like an accident. He could return to the clan after 7 years. That night he collected his most valuable belongings into headloads. His wives wept bitterly, and their children wept with them without knowing why. Obierica and a half a dozen other friends came to help and console him. They each made 9 or 10 trips carrying Okonkwo's yams to store in Obierica's barn. And before the cock crowed, Okonkwo and his family were fleeing to his motherland. It was a little village called Mbanta, just beyond the borders of Mbaino. So they're going past Mbaino. And if you recall, that's where Kemefuna is from. As soon as the day broke, a large crowd of men from Ezeudu's quarter stormed Okonkwo's compound, dressed in garbs of war. They set fire to his houses, demolished his red walls, killed his animals, and destroyed his barn. It was the justice of the earth goddess, and they were merely her messengers. They had no hatred in their hearts against Okonkwo. His greatest friend, Obierica, was among them. They were merely cleansing the land which Okonkwo had polluted with the blood of a clansman. Obierica was a man who thought about things. When the will of the goddess had been done, he sat down in his obi and mourned his friend's calamity. Why should a man suffer so grievously for an offense he had committed inadvertently? But although he thought for a long time, he found no answer. He was merely led into greater complexities. He remembered his wife's twin children whom he had thrown away. What crime had they committed? The earth had decreed that they were an offense on the land and must be destroyed. And if the clan did not exact punishment for an offense against the great goddess, her wrath was loosed on all the land and not just the offender. As the elder said, if one finger brought oil, it soiled all the others. So that's chapter 13, and it's kind of a downer of a chapter. There's a few things we need to think about, though. First, let's talk about this crime that Okonkwo has committed. This crime that Okonkwo has committed, being the female kind, may be an indication that Okonkwo is not as manly or as masculine as he thinks he is or as he wants to seem. The other thing we need to talk about is this last sentence here, where it says, if one finger brought oil, it soiled all the others. Now that's kind of like our saying here in the West where we say, one bad apple spoils the bunch. Thinking about it in a larger context, what might it mean if Okonkwo was the finger who brought oil? Next time we'll get into chapter 14 and part 2 of Things Fall Apart.